Good evening, and welcome to Navigating the News, Safeguarding Journalism in an Age of Misinformation. Can you hear me? I'm Ann Alpers, and I'm the class of 1984, and I'm here from Friends of the Smith College Libraries Executive Committee. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to thank the English Department and the American Studies Program for co-sponsoring this event. And I'd also like to thank Emily Egan from the class of 2004, Susan Faludi, John McMillan, Stacy Schmeidel, Jackie Richardson from the class of 2021, Jess Blasco, Kat Hanula, and Mary Irwin, who all helped to make tonight's program happen. Let me just say a word about the Friends of the Smith College Libraries. We're a group of alumni volunteers who care deeply about our libraries and special collections, and we want to ensure that our libraries thrive and remain the beloved and world-class collections and centers for collaboration that they've always been. We support many ongoing as well as innovative activities. If you get coffee during reading period or finals week in the library, that's thanks to the Friends. But we also help by staffing Smith's online repository, ScholarWorks. We help preserve out-of-print and rare materials. And most of all, we see the libraries on our campus as a shared resource that creates community, fosters scholarship, and celebrates literacy. And Friends celebrates and values literacy of all kinds. And news literacy could not be more essential than now. And that's why we're putting on this program and delighted to be doing so. With an election year fast approaching, we wanted to learn how news organizations function today, how news is sourced, how it's reported and produced in a time of great technological change. And we wanted to hear from women in the media about your experiences and the challenges that you've faced. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel of alumni. Sitting to your right, your left, sitting right here, is Karolina Miranda from the class of '93. Karolina, in addition to being a former member of the Executive Committee of Friends of the Smith College Library, is the Los Angeles Times staff writer, and she covers a wide gamut of culture, including visual art, architecture, and film, as well as cabaret art, cabaret divas performances. Her work often looks at how art intersects with politics, gender, and race, from the ways in which artists tackle the U.S.-Mexico border to the ways in which art intersects with development and gentrification. She's a regular contributor to KCRW's Press Play and was a winner of the 2017 Rabkin Prize in Visual Arts Journalism. And just last week it was announced that Karolina will be awarded the Smith College Medal this rally day. Sitting beside Karolina is Sarah Baker from the class of 2003, and Sarah's worked for over a dozen years as a TV news producer. She's currently the director of booking for MSNBC, and she serves as the point of contact for guests and contributors in Washington, D.C. Previously, she was NBC News' coordinating political producer. Sarah did that in the Washington, D.C. metro area, but before that, she worked as a senior producer for Good Morning America, ABC News, as a senior editorial producer at CNN, and a senior political producer at ABC News Digital Media Group. Sarah got her first break in television news as a Smith student intern on Nightline at ABC News. Kate O'Brien from the class of 1980 is the founder and CEO of O Media Strategies, which is a media consulting group. She works with a range of organizations, including the Washington Post, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the United Nations, and the Voice of America. Her work for VOA includes launching a half-hour weekly talk show, Our Voices, where African women bring the continent's most pressing issues to the table. Previously, Kate served as president of the award-winning Al Jazeera America, and before that, she had a long career at ABC, where she worked in a number of roles, finishing as Senior VP for News. Kate has won an Alfred A. DuPont Columbia University Award for Al Jazeera America, an Emmy Award for the 2000 Millennium coverage at ABC News, and a George Foster Peabody Award for ABC News' September 11th coverage. She's also the 2014 recipient of the Robert G. Magruder Award for Diversity Leadership. Our panel is moderated by Brooke Hauser, who's the editor-in-chief of the Daily Hampshire Gazette. A longtime journalist, she's written for Allure, Marie Claire, Glamour, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. She covered the film industry for several years as an editor and writer-at-large at Premiere. She's the author of Enter Helen, The Invention of Helen Gurley Brown and the Rise of the Modern Single Woman, for which she won the National Arts and Entertainment Journalism Award for Best Nonfiction Book. Her first book, The New Kids, Big Dreams and Brave Journeys at a High School for Immigrant Teens, won the American Library Association's 2012 Alex Award. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Now, as a technical announcement, I need to ask everyone to please be sure to silence your phones or other devices as we begin this panel. Thank you.
Testing. Well, thank you to everyone for being here and to the Friends of the Smith College Libraries for hosting us, and also to the Smith-Sophian newspaper for hosting us. We just had tea with the staff. It was actually seltzer and cookies, but it was great and much appreciated. And it's nice to see the turnout. I have some literal neighbors in the audience, which is really nice, and we're all happy to be here. You know, we just came from the Sophian, and one of the questions I had planned to ask the panelists is about their own experience at Smith if you worked at the Sophian. Now, you didn't, and you didn't, but Karolina, yeah, you did, right?
We'll swing this. Oh, it's working. I did work at the Sophian, covering, my first story was about, I'm really embarrassed to remember, I can't remember the name of the house. It was a house that was being decommissioned as a house and being turned into offices. Apparently the house had a ghost. And so my story was about this house. That was my first story for the Sophian.
All right. Were you on staff or just a freelancer?
I was on staff. I learned how to take pictures. I think one of the big things I did at the Sophian, it's like, I think the Sophian now, like the Sophian then, this would have been in the early 1990s, has always been like, you know, it doesn't get a ton of resources or attention. This is not a campus with like a big journalism program, even though, and back in my day, even suggesting that you wanted to take a journalism class, my advisor was like, that's a trade.
Right.
Like, you wouldn't want to do that. And I'm like, no. And I quickly realized that the Sophian did provide a lot of freedom where if you wanted to kind of carve out a beat, you could carve out a beat for yourself. And one of the things that, ironically, I ended up covering because I worked in the kitchens was labor. The SEIU contract was up for negotiation with the campus. There were going to be cuts, rumored cuts to the contract to service hours, some other employee benefits, and labor ended up, the Smith College labor ended up becoming a beat, and I think it ended up being really formative in terms of thinking about the campus beyond just, you know, our classes and the physical landscape of the campus, but the, you know, many working class people who make a place like this happen. And, you know, lo and behold, I'm now co-chair of the LA Times Guild, the first union in the LA Times 137-year history, so. So I'd say the Sophian really shaped me in ways I never imagined.
Well, at my college, I went to Kenyon College in Ohio, and there also was no journalism offerings. But now there is a journalism class at Smith, and I think that's great. I want to see more journalism classes at Smith and at Amherst College, and of course UMass has a good journalism program at Hampshire. You know, I wanted to talk to all of you about news literacy and the value of teaching journalism in school. We could talk about college, we could talk about high school, earlier than that. You know, what should we be doing in terms of teaching news literacy?
Yeah, I'm super passionate about this. It makes me crazy when people don't actually understand what they are reading. I had an opportunity to teach journalism at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And one of the lectures I gave there, I was talking about websites and sponsored content and what the difference was between actual original content and sponsored content. And it was about a size, about like this. And I asked for a show of hands of how many, these were freshman journalism students in college, how many people knew what sponsored content was, and maybe 3 people raised their hands. And I was so shocked that they had arrived in journalism school and did not actually, they were not literate in what news was. There are so many opportunities now to teach that, and there are a couple of great news organizations or news literacy organizations that are going out to middle schools and high schools and even colleges to teach the teachers how to teach kids what the difference is between something that's content, something that's not content, something that's biased, a photo that's faked. With technology, what it is now, there's so much that can be manipulated, and without the electorate, the people in this country and around the world, stepping up to learn what the difference is, I don't know how we have a civil discourse in this country. It's a tough situation because it's being manipulated by so many people who have particular bents, but it's imperative that starting at a very young age, we have people learning what real journalism is.
I'd love to weigh in on the journalistic end of that and the importance of teaching journalism. I don't know if there are any administrators here, but I just think it is such a crucial thing, not just to be literate in how to read it, but how to produce it. And that I think anybody who's been in a position to hire young journalists often encounters young people who think journalism is rewriting the stuff that you saw on another website, when in fact it's not. It's like real journalism takes time, it's costly, it requires phone calls, it requires knocking on doors, it requires chasing people down, doing archive research, making freedom of information requests, and doing all of these things that I think are key research things that you learn in a university, but people see the story that runs in the paper and they think it's easy, and they don't, I think, always realize the amount of work that goes into producing that.
I think one of the best ways to be a careful reader is to be trained as a journalist and to be trained as a fact checker, which every reporter should be. And, yeah, I mean, Smith has had these creative nonfiction classes for a long time. By another name, they would be called journalism classes. So in a sense, Smith has been teaching journalism all along. I mean, when I was researching my book about Helen Gurley Brown here, I got into the files of, Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan. And I would say, I mean, Gloria Steinem's a journalist. She's kind of, pitched as an activist, and she is, of course, but she started as a journalist. Betty Friedan was also a journalist. I mean, she wrote for Glamour. She wrote for Cosmo, actually, when it was still like a general magazine before Helen took control of it. But there are so many people who have come through Smith who are journalists, and they've just been called other things because there is this kind of understanding of journalism as a trade. But it can be a trade. You should be able to earn money at your job, and it can also be elevated to an art, and it's important. So I would like to see it taught as well. More.
I think we're probably all in agreement on
Yeah,
the stage.
yeah.
Can we do something about that?
Well, so I work at the Daily Hampshire Gazette, and one thing that we're sometimes surprised about, we have such an educated readership, knowledgeable and very engaged, but even still, there are things that the public just doesn't know about the news process. Reporters are often in situations where they have to explain what on the record means, what off the record means, what background means, what deep background means, like all of these things. And also sometimes we get requests that surprise us, like yes, I'm glad that we did this interview. Happy to take part. So just send me the article when you're done, and I'll read it for you. And if I have any changes, I'll let you know. And that's a big no-no.
Send me the questions in advance.
Send me the questions in advance. I mean, all kinds of things. And so I'm just I'm wondering in your careers what you've encountered, whether it's with, source or a viewer or a reader, someone who is. What do people need to know that they don't know?
Well, one of the things I do now is I work in live television, cable news, which I know can sometimes be a dirty word, cable news. But it's really a fascinating time to be in cable news because things are moving so quickly. So my job, I help with a lot of the people that you see speaking. So that's guest appearances, and it can be anything from a president to a first lady to a senator to an expert. And so I think a little bit to your point of how do we get people to speak to us and talk to us, one of actually the fundamental problems that we have in cable news, for good or for bad, is that in the age of Twitter, we will have a guest come on and we'll be like, today we're going to talk about kittens, puppies, and lollipops. But then the president tweets something and everything is completely pivoted. And I think a lot of people who want to come on and share commentary, and of course are so thoughtful about that and have things pre-planned, as we all do. Okay, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? And then the entire conversation pivots. And I think that's a lot of the struggle that we have in cable news, because at 10 in the morning, we can say we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But with this administration, especially in the political sphere that we're in, everything changes 10:30, 10:35, 11 o'clock. God help you if you're a publisher and you have an author on the air. We have to sometimes cancel guests, rejigger, rebook. So I think just a little bit from my perspective to your question is that we're constantly trying to juggle what the demand of the news of the day is, especially within cable news, and try to keep a continuum of the bigger themes while also pivoting to these really huge breaking news stories that viewers do want to hear about. And we almost can't wait, because in the age of Twitter, on your phones, you're already seeing it, so we have to kind of keep up with that. I think part of the argument of the 6:30 broadcast and the fundamentals and the issues that sometimes the broadcast networks are having is that things have already been seen. So I think the conversation about dialogue and source conversations and how those things change, the pace of what we do has just dramatically changed. And I've kind of seen that arc, and it is faster than ever before. So it's really one of the challenges that we have, I would say, at least on the TV broadcast part of things.
I would add to that at least every organization that I've been a part of or been known about has controls in place, whether it's ethical policies or ombudsman or standards people, policies that the news organizations have to follow, which I think, honestly, a lot of people are just assume does not exist. And we're in such a polarized world these days, so that if someone disagrees with what they see in the paper or on a website or on TV, they'll just decide, well, they've come up with that on their own, rather than understanding that certainly for the larger organizations, there's always an ethical policy. There are always controls, and nobody's perfect. Things fall through the cracks. This is a sad truth, but it is a truth. And any ethical organization will deal with that and apologize and fix it and all that. But I think that increasingly people just jump to, oh no, they're just putting that out because they are coming from a certain point of view.
I want to step back for a second and ask each of you to describe what you do. Just, maybe we can do it on a daily basis. Like, what's a typical day like for you, Karolina?
Well, I cover art and culture for the LA Times, and I mostly work from home. I don't work in the office, and usually I'm either out reporting or writing. So every Monday I send an email to my editors giving them a list of everything I'm working on. If somebody suddenly dies, if, a meteor hits Brad Pitt, if all of the sort of crazy things that can have, a painting falls off a wall and smashes into a million bits, I might be called in to do breaking news. But for the most part, I tend to do more long form reported stories, and that's usually a combination of stories, sometimes like Q&As, sometimes profiles, but also sometimes more profound things that require a lot of reporting. And I think that's one of the things, sort of looping back in your earlier question in terms of what people don't have an understanding about, is that sometimes because things move so quickly, you sometimes get these questions from readers of like, why hasn't the LA Times covered this yet? Why isn't this guy died 5 minutes ago. Why isn't the obit online? It's like, well, because someone has to write it. It has to be edited.
By the way, you write
checked.
great obituaries.
Oh, thank you.
We did a whole...
I love obituaries.
Karolina Skyped with my class at Smith, and it was all about obituary writing.
Obituary writing is the best writing there is, because it's like you can write a profile and the person's dead, so they can't harass you later. I want to change that. No, they're gone. But I think, I've done stories about like the intersection of art and gentrification. I did a big report about the intersection of that in Boyle Heights, and it was not a story I had covered sort of drop by drop as it broke, but instead I had wanted to take a step back and do like a broader piece, and it was a piece that required me to get zoning documents and talk to zoning people and look at development and get property records and track owners of properties down. Like, it was this really intensive piece of reporting that required weeks to, this thing that people read in 10 minutes requires weeks to put together. And I think ended up being a really important piece. But I think that sometimes if there is a lack of understanding about what we do, is that sometimes those really significant pieces that you read, those stories about like Harvey Weinstein or whatever, like those stories were sometimes being reported for a year before they went into the paper. And so I think thinking about that and thinking about the expectation, the demand that we put on news, plays a
One thing
role in
that
this
can be
too.
helpful, that we have a reporter, Dusty Christensen at the Gazette, who does this a lot. He describes the process that he goes through in reporting something. So if he's doing a public records request and it gets denied and he has to appeal, like he might say that in the article. Or if he's trying to get in touch with someone and they don't return his call multiple times, he'll say that in the article. Or if he gets bounced from one place to another, he'll say that. And he's constantly kind of like pulling aside the curtain to show people how it works, which I think is really helpful.
Oh, for
as
sure.
a reader. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, during the gentrification story, I was trying to interview these activists that have been protesting a lot of the art galleries that have been showing up in this part of Los Angeles. And a lot of them are very lefty and militant, and they don't reveal their IDs. And I had been trying to get some of them on the phone just to understand their motivation and some of the tactics. And they would not respond to any of my emails. And then finally I tracked one of them down on Facebook, sent them multiple messages on Facebook, and then finally I get this message back saying, this like paragraph-long screed about how they won't talk to me because I'm a sellout, working for the sellout LA Times for sellout whatever. And so I just published the whole thing like as part of my story of like, okay, if you're wondering why this point of view was not reported in the story, well, here's why I tried, because I'm a sellout.
So again, I work obviously in a network news network now, so it's a very fast pace. But the one thing I will say that I absolutely love about TV is it is a team sport. Nothing happens on your own. So if you're one of those people who like is an introvert and wants to sit in your office and just kind of do your own thing, this is not necessarily. There are some jobs maybe in that, but not a lot. So we are in constant meetings. Just Kate's point earlier, there's so many different functions of a news network, from the ethics aspect to the production aspect. So our first meeting, gulp, starts at 7:30. That's on the phone. We're going through all the morning shows. What are they doing? That does not include the morning shows. Those meetings have already happened overnight. What are the dayside shows doing starting from 9 onward? What are the producers doing? What are the bookings going to be? What are we lacking? What do we have? Then we move to the 9 o'clock network call. Okay, what is everyone reporting? What are we on? What are the beats on? And I love that call because it's like everyone's chiming in, and this is what we've learned, and this is what we have, and this is the latest reporting on this, and this is off the record, and it's like, I just feel like I get to hear the newspapers. It's like our own internal feed of what's happening, and that I just feel so informed, even though I'm constantly reading all the time. After the 9 o'clock call, oh wait, sorry, I missed the 8 a.m. field call about what's happening in the different bureaus. Then there's a 10 o'clock call that has all the primetime call, all the primetime shows and what we're doing. It's a good time for me to like try to race out the door. And then at 1 o'clock, we have a politics call, followed by another call. I mean, there's so many calls. And in between that, you're emailing, you're getting emails, you're calling other folks. And it's a constant sense of consumption. What are we putting out? What do we have to take in? What are all the, bells and whistles and traps that we have to make sure we're filling? And the best part of my day, I think, is when we have all these calls and we see all these things that we're discussing, and then you look up and it's on TV. And you're like, oh, we nailed it. And then you like have this moment where you're like, oh, now I have to go with the other things. Like, you never really get a chance to really be like, wow, that was a great job. Because then you have to kind of go to the next thing. And yeah, you have like 2 minutes and then you go. It's like my job is called a booking producer. And so the joke with booking producers, like, what have you done for me lately? What's your booking? So, for example, I booked President Obama like on this huge, amazing interview that we did. And then the next day it's like, okay, what's next? So, in TV news, that's just kind of the pace. So it's very intense. I think the last meeting of the day is around 4:30 for a huge group meeting, and then all the primetime shows kind of kick into gear. But it's constant, and I think we're constantly on email. You see my phone here.
She has 2 phones.
I have 2 phones because I need to be connected at all times. So sometimes AT&T doesn't work, sometimes Verizon doesn't work, so I have to have connection.
What do you do if you have a sick day or unexpectedly out?
It's very hard. It is hard to take sick days. It's hard to leave. I think this pace is very intense. Like right now, I'm waiting to see if someone from the Intel committee is going to text back and do something later this evening. I mean, that's kind of the pace that we're at right now, and that booking matters, right? Because that could be news that pushes the impeachment story ahead, Ukraine story. So it's just things like that that are kind of consistent. But because it's a team sport, you have to rely on your teammates, and you can't always be the one to score the goal. So if you're not comfortable with passing the ball, you're not cut out for this business. But I do think the best part about it is, for me, just meeting so many types of people. And that's from the engineers to the floor techs to the editorial to the desk. And I think that's what I love about it, because there's just so many different types that you don't even realize what it takes when you see that broadcast. There's one anchor looking polished, sitting at that table, and there's just so much that goes into it. So that's powerful for me and kind of addictive, if you will. It keeps me in the game.
So after 37 years of doing that, I still have 2 phones, and I still sleep with both of them under my pillow.
Wait, you're joking.
I'm not joking.
Oh my God.
I know. It's just a habit at this point. But she's right. AT&T works some places, and Verizon worked other places, so I'm always using both. So after leaving that full-time craziness, I started my own consulting business 2 years ago. So my day is a very different kind of day from these guys. I have different clients who, if you're in the business 37 years the way I was, you have a lot of experience doing a lot of different things. So every day is different because I have a bunch of different clients. So with Voice of America, I spent all of last year completely redoing a 24/7 cable network and news channel and digital operation in Farsi, and including hiring new people, new graphics, new music, new studios, new everything. I helped launch and develop a show that's focused on the Anglophone African audience that's anchored by 4 women. It's a serious current affairs show, which is an unusual thing both for VOA and for the African audience to have a women's show that is not about fashion or beauty or celebrity. I work with the Washington Post, which has a really quite developed video operation, and there's 75 people in their video department, and so I help them work. I know. Yeah, that's right. It's like journalism envy, resource envy. And they're doing more live programming, and they are trying to figure out what to do with some of the many resources that Jeff Bezos has allowed them to have, which is a nice thing. And then I also, I have some days where I sit in my office at home and, talk to people about management and various other things. So for me, I'm at a point now where I can kind of take a step back and get involved in the things that I want to get involved in, whether they're sort of macro efforts.
But you're just coming back from East Africa this morning. When did you get back?
Last night.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And
I woke up at 12:30 this morning. I'm a little jet lagged.
Right. And Sarah, you are Washington to New York to Northampton?
Yes, so NBC is based in New York at 30 Rock,
Yeah.
so I do a lot of meetings there, but
Right.
got my Delta points.
And you came from LA today, yesterday?
No, I got here 2 days ago. I was in Boston first.
Oh, okay. All right.
So, and I'll go back home through Chicago because the Chicago Architecture Biennial is up.
Perfect.
So
Nice.
I'll nerd out on that.
Well, I want to talk a bit about how your news organizations have changed over the years. Karolina, you were talking earlier about, you're a big part of the union there now. You could talk about that a little bit. We can just kind of go down the line again. Big changes.
Oh, wow. The LA Times has been nothing but big changes. We used to be owned by Tribune Company, which is based in Chicago, also owns the Chicago Tribune, a number of other papers, the Orlando Sentinel, and other regional papers. And they had, let's just say their management had grown increasingly terrible. And so they were doing things like laying off journalists. The executive team was paying themselves like $15 million consulting bonuses for I don't know what. Our CEO used to have a private plane on hand. I don't know what CEO of any newspaper company has a private plane. Dean Baquet of the New York Times is not running around a private plane. And so we unionized, and this was big news at the LA Times, which historically anti-union paper, founded by a crazy guy named Harrison Gray Otis, the Colonel, he was called, his whole vision of Los Angeles in the late 19th century and early 20th century is that Los Angeles would have no Mexicans, no African Americans, and no unions. It would be the great white spot.
Wow.
So now his union is co-chaired by a Latina. So obviously that did not work out for the good Colonel, but the unionization led Tribune to sell the paper to a local businessman in Los Angeles because all of a sudden with the union, the Tribune wasn't going to be able to do some of the things they wanted to do. So last June, we were acquired by Patrick Soon-Shiong, who's a biotech billionaire, far smaller billionaire than Jeff Bezos, but a billionaire nonetheless, who's locally based in Los Angeles and has committed quite a bit of resources to the paper. We've probably hired, when we launched the union, our unit was 380 people, and now we're up to almost like 470 journalists. So he's committed a lot of resources to the paper. We're in a different building now, and we are in the process of bargaining our first contract. And I think this has been a really interesting point when we think about like journalism in this day and age and the role of newspapers and the importance of newspapers as primary sources of news. John Oliver has done some great segments about this, so just Google that, like John Oliver and newspapers. But I think journalists feeling that we work in this industry that is imperiled, that financially, that it is imperiled in terms of what we do of people not being able to distinguish the real from the fake. It is imperiled in the sense that our profession is regularly attacked at the highest levels of government. A Washington Post columnist was dismembered in Turkey, and our government did nothing about it. The Capital Gazette in Maryland was a site of a mass shooting. That was a Tribune publication, a sister publication of ours. So it's this time where it feels like, even though I cover art and architecture and I'm not out in the trenches doing the hard news, it's a difficult time to be a journalist. And I think part of the interesting thing about unionization and the moment that the LA Times finds itself in is this sense of like, you know, this is important. What we do is a public service. What we do to some degree is a civic duty. It's the First Amendment, not the second or third or fourth or fifth. It's the first. It's the basis of our democracy, and that we as journalists need to protect that. That it's not just about profit, that it's about protecting what we do and being able to have these platforms where we can, you know, expound ideas and investigate the corrupt and tell stories about who we are. And so I think the LA Times now finds itself in this moment. We are in month 15 of bargaining and hope to wrap up our contract soon, but I think that will mark a really important tipping point for my newspaper.
I would just say one of the big changes, especially since 2016, has just been the level of security that you don't feel as a journalist as you did before. And you almost want to hide a little bit behind maybe a different cover if you're going somewhere. I don't necessarily tell people all the time what I do, where I work. I'm very cautious, to your point of what happened in Maryland, what happened in France. I mean, there's just people out there and you're not really sure of what their intent is. And I think that to me is very worrisome, because already as a woman growing up, you know, you have a sense of, okay, you're always looking around but as a journalist now attached to that, when I go to a debate site, which we're traveling all the time to debates, as you can imagine, we're going to all these different political events, the level of security is so much higher. I have a relationship with the NBC security team that I never had before. I know them, they know us, and I think a lot of the correspondents in the field feel the same way. I think it was the first Trump rally when he said, oh, there's, you know, the fake media's in the back, and people were booing and throwing things. And that was just a shifting moment, right? Where, like, you're now on display. You're not really tucked behind. And I do think there are times where I'm really cautious about, where am I wearing my lanyard? And, you know, is my ID out? And things that I wasn't as cognizant about. I mean, think about how many of you go to work and probably have your ID on you. Like, you probably don't think much about it, but if someone sees the brand or the emblem and they make a comment, I try to avoid those situations more so. And that's what I found is a huge difference in the last couple of months, is just having my own sense of security, but also making sure that I cover myself a little bit in terms of telling folks, if I meet on a plane or a train, I am very much more cautious than I think I was prior.
I know a number of reporters at print organizations in particular that will never cop to this because they don't want it public, but have personal security now because they have to, because they are targets. But I want to talk about something else that goes beyond that threat to journalists, which is also a threat to journalism. But there's another thing that we've all been living with, which is the threat to journalism in that local news. Thank God you guys are doing okay. Local news is really having a hard time. More local papers have shut down just in the last few weeks. A couple of great, you know, local, The Vindicator, and I forget the other one that just shut down this week. It's a huge, huge problem, and it's a problem that has so many different causes and no blanket answer. It's because of technology. It's because of the change in how people purchase things. It's Craig Newmark's fault for inventing Craigslist, although he did give $20 million to a journalism school, which was good. But it's really changed the way journalism exists, particularly for local papers. And there's been such a shift to public either donation or rich people, like, you know, you're a billionaire, the Washington Post billionaire. You need a billionaire. Well, and it's a fascinating challenge, because what happens when there is no free press without rich people or donations from people like you to make it happen? And so there are existential threats all over journalism right now that just make it a really challenging situation. So it goes everywhere from personal safety to what will we be like as a civil society without journalism? And so how do we shift the financial model so that we can actually do this? Because it is not inexpensive to do. Journalism, you were describing how you take weeks, months, sometimes a year to do a story. You're talking about a collaborative work. When you go out in television or even sometimes in print, you take a group of people. You are reporting. It all takes time. It all takes money, and it's a really challenging thing to now that people are used to getting stuff for free on the internet, they don't get that this costs money to do, and what you're getting for it is something extremely important. So I don't mean to sound totally depressing, because there have been some interesting changes. For example, the Denver Post shut down, which was a great newspaper, and it unfortunately was just sort of attacked bit by bit by bit and shut down. But now the public radio station in Denver is filling that gap and really going after local news in a way that they weren't before. And so you see these shifts happening, and frankly, we don't know where it's going to be in 10 years. We don't know where it's going to be in 20 years. But there is this evolution of how news gets created and disseminated that I think we're just sort of in the beginnings of this change.
I mean, at the Gazette, we have good resources, but they're limited, like any small newsroom. And that can be, I'm a pretty optimistic person, and there can be advantages to that. When you have limited resources, it forces you to get very creative. So one thing that came along recently that we jumped at, and it was brought to me by a reporter I mentioned earlier, Dusty Christensen, and another young reporter, Greta Yoakum is her name. And they told us about this initiative that was happening, started by Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation and The Guardian in England. And basically it's, they got together over 250 news media outlets around the world, and everybody pledged that they were going to cover climate change for a week and just flood the paper with stories about climate change. So we signed on to do that. And I'm mentioning it because it's for me, it was like the first time that we've participated in a new model like that. And what was so cool about it is that, the organization that started it basically acted as a clearinghouse for all these articles, so that we were able to share our articles with like almost 300 other places around the world if they wanted to use it. And then we got to run articles that were, coming out of The Nation, The Guardian, Columbia Journalism Review, and really from all the other papers and magazines and outlets that were sharing their content with us. So we did. And it was awesome. And, when we talk about journalism as expensive, that was free. That was free. I mean, of course, we were investing in our own work and sharing it, but we got free access to all of their stuff, which our readers really appreciated. So, now we're in talks to do similar projects maybe for the census. There's another project happening with the census count also through Columbia. So, I think about new models. What could a new model be all the time?
Yeah, so do I. And
more sharing
and
like that.
Partnerships. There are more and more partnerships. If you listen to NPR, you'll hear that, so Trump Inc., which is a podcast that WNYC does out of New York, but it's a partnership with ProPublica, who else? NYC, ProPublica, there are two others that are in there. And so they're constantly figuring out other ways to bring more people in, because we all want the same outcome, which is more information for the listeners or the readers or the viewers.
Well, I wanted to switch topics for a second and talk a bit about ethical reporting. And I'm just curious, have you, Karolina, your eyes just, have you maybe recently had a time where you've been in a bind, or, had a moment that has been difficult to sort out, or an ethical dilemma as a reporter?
I cover art and architecture, so
Oh, but you
the
cover
dilemmas are
immigration.
not. I do,
and
the
race,
border.
and you cover you cover everything through art and
Yeah,
culture.
I mean, I feel like at the LA Times, it's interesting to think about the ethical thing because this is actually the whole ethics guidelines is something that the union is bargaining. So the guidelines, because they are policies that govern our workplace, and we bargain all policies that cover our workplace, from dress code, which we just got scrapped because it was.
There is a dress code?
There was a dress code, and it was very like gender focused. It's like skirts shouldn't be this long, and there should be no. I mean, most of it
To
was
wear pantyhose?
Most of it was geared at women. Yeah, it was mostly a lot of dress codes are geared at women, and so yeah, we raised hell and we got it. We're like, the dress code is now dress appropriately. That's it. It's like we're all grown ups. Like nobody needs to measure anybody's skirt. But so we are thinking about the ethics guidelines, and the LA Times has very strong ethics guidelines. I've also worked for NPR as a freelancer. If you're a freelancer for NPR, you have to sign on for the NPR ethics guidelines, which means, you know, you can't be in the position to potentially be paid by any outside organizations you cover. Like, you know, I know a lot of art writers that curate shows and write catalog essays and do all of this kind of stuff, that they go and give speeches at fancy galleries or get flown out to Doha to some art and architecture confab where, you know, they give a speech. And yeah, and we can't, I mean, there are very strict rules that govern those kinds of rules, the kinds of relationships we can have with the people we cover. There was a case of a LA Times reporter who got canned because he was sleeping with the publicist of a school he was investigating for some sort of malfeasance and hadn't disclosed the relationship to management, and it had in some capacity tainted his coverage. And so these issues of, I think, I haven't necessarily had personal quandaries about ethics because I feel like I know very strongly where the ethics stand. And actually in the art business, people try to give me gifts all the time, which I respectfully decline all the time. But it's thinking about how can we create these strong guidelines so that the public is aware that when they do read a story in the LA Times, that it's not some like journalist who's been flown around on some junket and put up on the Four Seasons and received all kinds of graft and is, you know, buddy with whoever is running the show. Because I think if there's one thing that I guess we can hope will give our media organization some sense of importance, it is that we are to some degree above certain things.
Do you publish your ethics policy online?
I think it is online, but it's probably the Tribune policy that was on the Tribune website, and I don't know what happened to that. So I wouldn't be able to tell you right now if the LA Times specifically has its ethics policy online, but that's a really good question.
Yeah, I've always found that news organizations that publish their policies online, I just think it's the transparency that's really needed.
Well, Sarah, with you, it's a slightly different question. I'm just wondering how you decide to give maybe is it, you know, your decision, you know, how to, when you decide to give a platform to someone who you know, not just who you don't agree with, of course it's important to hear all viewpoints, but someone whose speech is offensive, maybe borderline hateful, because we see all kinds of people on TV all the time, including our president, and, you know, where do you draw that line, like, that you're going to let this person say this on TV or not? You know, how do you make those decisions?
So I will say one of the hardest jobs right now is to be in the standards department of any organization, broadcast organization whatsoever. And one of the things, though, that I kind of go through on a daily basis with these guests that we're booking is you'd be surprised because a lot of people, of course, email and tweet like, why didn't you have the other person on? Well, we asked, and part of my job is to make sure we ask, right, and to send out those notes and to know that we're going to do the segment. But it's also interesting if you listen to how the standards teams are writing those segments and the pronouncers before that. So sometimes you'll hear the anchor say, we've reached out, they're welcome on the show, and we have to honor that, right? So there's a lot of segments that we go on throughout the day, and I'll look, you know, I'm constantly looking at rundowns, looking at the guests. Okay, did we forget something here? Did we forget something here? Oh, you want to have that guest on? Okay, that person's running for Congress, actually. So did you invite the other person on? And those are really hard conversations, right? Because you could be like, well, that's not what I want my show to be. And I totally get that, right? Like, that's not always ideal. And so part of it is having that back and forth with your colleagues, talking to the standards team, making sure we get those statements. If they're not added in, let's say, for example, the segment's at 10:05, but then the person responds at 10:52. Well, what do you do? And how do you add that in? And so it's a huge process that we constantly go through. And I've had that happen, and I think we try to do the best we can in the moments that we have. And we're constantly, we have hour-by-hour programs, and we're a little nimble, right? Because we can say, okay, we're going to do this segment. Now this person's agreed to do something. And so the standards team, bless them, have done an amazing job and really helped us kind of navigate those waters. But I do think it's a daily challenge. I don't wake up one day being like, I'm gonna nail today. Today I got it. Because I don't have it. It's gonna be every day is gonna be kind of a struggle. And we're gonna try to figure it out and do the best that we can and make the right calls where we see them. The other thing that's a little bit tricky is, for example, you may email and call somebody and want to have this person on, and then they might tweet something, right? So we have this whole other dimension of how we also can cover folks is, adding their point of view from a tweet, which may not be a live in-guest studio, but trying to incorporate those things. So every single day, we really kind of we have a challenge on our hands. So we do the best we can, but I don't try to say that I'm an arbiter. I tried the best I can of what is right, what is wrong. I mean, the needle kind of moves as we go for every story. So,
and the other thing to think of is you're trying to be fair, but you also have to stay away from a false equivalence, because there are way too many examples of, well, we're going to have this person on who thinks this. Well, we're going to have that person on who thinks that, when in fact the two things are not even in the same plane. So it's complicated.
and especially well, as you know, I cover a lot of the politics. So, what was it? At one point we had 20 campaigns. Try fitting 20 campaigns into an hour of all these different, it's very difficult. And you're trying to do the best you can with all the different arguments and conversations that are happening. And to Kate's point, essentially, I think we're trying to be honest arbiters of what we do, and hopefully you have some of the smartest people in the room, which I think for the most part NBC really does a great job of cultivating those people, and all different types of people with different backgrounds and point of views, regardless of what others may say. So it's that groupthink atmosphere as well that I think helps propel.
You referenced a standards team. We don't have that at newspapers. What is that exactly?
A standards team, at least in all the television news companies I know, they are people who are the arbiters of what the ethical standards are for journalism for that organization. And sometimes they are lawyers, sometimes they are not, sometimes they are just the great Marion Porges, NBC. Who, man, that is a job I would never want, because it is constant, because they have to be looking at, listening to, and reading every single thing that goes out from that.
They're kind of like editors in a sense. Or?
Well, yes and no. They're not editors as in, we're going to edit for. Well, yeah, sometimes they are editors, actually.
It seems like there's no natural correlation here, but at a newspaper, that's what an editor would do, and our standard would be AP style, in other ways. But this is something different.
It's everything. It's fairness. It's what are the journalistic policies, the ethics policies at the organization. Now, when I was at Al Jazeera America, we did not. I was the standards person. So we didn't have a whole team, but we weren't as big as NBC or ABC or CNN.
Pause at Al Jazeera America, and I want to ask you, how you landed at that top spot. It's an interesting journey. We emailed about it a little bit, and
How did I end up there? I was at ABC News for my whole career. I started there as an intern in 1979, before I even finished here. and then worked my way up, from the bottom, blah, 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 all the way through. Worked in New York, Washington, London, Rome, back in New York, Atlanta, a little in LA, back in New York. And I was in my last job there, which was the senior vice president for news, and I was in charge of a whole bunch of different parts of the organization, and I was headhunted. There was this new channel coming that was a purely American-focused version of Al Jazeera English, the English-speaking Al Jazeera global news organization, and they were looking for someone to run it, and so I think they talked to a lot of people, and I got the job. So, and I was interested in it because it was so much different from what a lot of people thought. It was not a channel that was doing Middle Eastern news. It was not a channel that was doing Muslim news, or as someone said, terror news. It was a channel that was really about telling stories from the ground up, and from all over the world, but for an American audience. And I was really interested in joining that organization because I've lived overseas, and I am passionate about news from around the globe. And I think it's really important for Americans to be seeing what's happening around the world. And frankly, the American news networks just don't do that much and haven't been doing it as much in the last 10, 15 years. So the opportunity to be at a place where we had, this is not an exaggeration, we had 80 bureaus around the world. Some of them were tiny, but we had 80 locations around the world where we could be creating content from. It was too good to pass up.
I want to ask all of you another question, and then we should probably be wrapping up somewhat soon. But, so I've been asked before, what is it like being the first woman editor of the Gazette? Actually, Susan has asked me that last year, and I didn't really have a good answer for it because I didn't know, and I didn't think that there was anything different about it. Actually, I feel a little differently about it now. I do have things to say. I'm not going to say them right here because you're the panelists. But But just in the way I deal with people, the way confrontations play out, there are all kinds of things. The other day, I dropped lipstick on the floor and accidentally walked over it and smushed it all into the carpet of the managing editor, and it's still there and it's never going away. And I was like, that's one way it's different being a woman editor. So, I guess a question I have for all of you is, do you think it's gotten easier to be a woman moving into a position of leadership? Have you ever? Was it difficult for you at any point, or? What? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'm older than everybody on this panel. It was really hard at the beginning. It was really, especially getting into management, where very, very, very often I was the only woman in the room, and I've had my Me Too stories like everybody else. You can't really live in this world without Me Too stories, particularly in media. I think it has changed. Would I say it's gotten easier? I think the challenges are different, but there are still lots of challenges. But I do think I have seen more companies with women in positions of authority that have changed the way they are doing things, not just dropping lipstick on the floor, but changing how they deal with their employees. I know people who have changed the maternity leaves because they went through that, who have changed, the way the 401ks are done. I mean, things like that have that are a direct result of having a woman in a position of authority. But it's still so far from where it needs to be.
I would say when I got into this business right out of college, I don't think I'd really even realized. I was just so excited to be there that it didn't really occur to me. But as I, of course, age in the business, I'm much more aware of that and aware of other women who are in roles of leadership and and they have increased a bit. I don't think they are where they need to be when I look around at my various meetings, and when I look around these tables, I still think there's some growth that has to come to that. I just, as a manager and helping to manage people who are, hopefully going to grow as well, I just try to go into every day with positive intent of like, how can I make this experience the best it can be, right? Even in a hard situation, because you can get angry and upset and frustrated. And I think I've learned from past experiences with past managers that scaring people kind of works, but not really fully works. I mean, it works in the short term, but I really try to go to it in a sense of like, okay, how do we get to this person to the next place? And also, how do I help cultivate young women who, every intern that I have, I remind myself that like that could be my next boss, right? Because the media industry, you just never know. And so I do really try to like help mentor young women, and I want them to feel comfortable to talk to me, because I think one of the things that I lacked as growing up in the different organizations, and I didn't feel like I had those people to go to, because, well, no. As much, but in the sense of, I thought that I see a few, oh, look, I can speak to this person, and I want those young women to feel like they can come to me. So that's what I'm trying to do, just in the culture of everyday life for me as I work with the employees at MSNBC.
It's such an interesting question, because I feel like the advances women have made in media are obviously incredible. Those advances often come last to the fine arts section of any newspaper. I think because those critical roles, and by the critical roles I mean the critics, the classical music critic, the art critic, the architecture critic, those are jobs that people tend to hang out in for a very long time. And in fact, I remember when I showed up for my first meeting at the LA Times, like I walked in and I was like, whoa, are women allowed here? Like, that was 5 years ago, And I think, and looking at it from the other lens too, the LA Times is a newspaper in majority Latino Los Angeles, and our Latino staff doesn't hit, I don't think even 20%. At the paper, and I think issues of pay equity have been an issue. The types of one of the first things the LA Times Guild, our union, did was a pay equity study that looked at men versus women, and also white reporters versus people of color, that showed these like tremendous gaps in pay. I mean, that's something that women and people of color have been dealing with forever. This kind of like unarticulated thing that is happening, and then all of a sudden, when you see it in black and white, it's there. And so I feel like that's the pay issue has not gone away. Women still earn less than men do, overwhelmingly. And certainly the resource issue. Who is given the time to do the investigative story that takes 12 months and has all their other assignments cleared off their desk while they do this? Who is given the travel budgets to do stories in other places? I think things have changed for me at the Times in the last few years, but like the first year I was there, I really had to, it's like they would send off a music critic to Poland with a photographer at the drop of a hat to go cover some weird music festival in a salt mine, but I had to like bang down doors to get sent to Tijuana to do an art story, and Tijuana's 2 hours away. And so I think those types of things, and especially for people of color, I think are still a very real thing in newsrooms, and in terms of having our stories seen as stories that are important to cover, and not just some marginal thing to cover that in a place like Los Angeles cover. Like I had a reader write me a story one day. He was like, "You're such a good writer, and you're always covering these Latino stories, and you should tell the LA Times to do other stories too, because you're very good. I don't know why you only do those stories." First of all, it's not true. I do all kinds of stories. And secondly, I was like, this is Los Angeles. If I'm not doing Latino stories, I'm not covering Los Angeles. Like it's just part of the reality of living here. And it's seen as lesser. And I think there is still that impression of newsrooms that stories about women, stories that affect women, stories that affect people of color are somehow lesser stories. They're not the important stories. The important stories are Washington, the presidency, the state house. Those kinds of power things and other things are not important. And so I think shifting those attitudes, like as you see more women in power, it's changing, but boy, they are hard to beat back. But, you know, I went here, so I don't ever shut up.
There was an interesting statistic, at least 2 years ago, I gave a speech. There was a statistic by the ASNI, American, yeah,
American Society of Magazine
or it was news editors.
News editors.
Yeah, yeah, newspaper, ASNI, that the number of women compared to the number of men in supervisory positions had actually decreased since the 70s. There was a huge upswing,
Yeah.
and then it started, leveling off and then decreased. And I mean, I was flabbergasted by that. And I don't know where it is now. It's now 3 years later. I hope it's gone back up. But that was, just depressing.
One thing I just wanted to add is, because I believe we talked about this in your notes, but one of the most, I think, powerful people in the Washington bureau at ABC News that I just wanted to mention who was lovely was Cokie Roberts. And I just wanted to take a minute to let everyone know that, I mean, talk about a woman in media and gravitas and kindness, and I'm sure Kate worked, yes, and just, it didn't matter if you were 22 and had just started working. I mean, she brought me into her office on day one. I worked for Sam Donaldson for years, and she's like, "Why did you take this job?" And she coached me through, and when he barked at me, I could run into her office, and I just, she is just one of the, like a woman in media that I just wanted to make sure that we spoke about her, because she was just incredible.
She always helped the women who came behind her. It's going to make me cry, so I'll stop talking.
She's just a wonderful person. I think the outpouring that you saw, it was so genuine because all of those people felt so touched by her. And I think in this business, you don't get that very often. And so she was just such a powerful force. And so I'm like, okay, what would Cokie do? So that's just been a wonderful legacy, I think, to have. And in the past few weeks, all the folks that came, it was just really powerful. And I think that meant something.
Do you have, oops, wow.
Touching the stage.
Well, on that note, I was just, like, 2 more questions, but I was just curious if you have or had mentors other than Cokie Roberts in your careers.
I did not at the beginning of my career, but later on, I had mentors, and they are still there.
Even though he barked, Sam Donaldson is a treasure. I was one of the most wonderful people I've ever worked for and taught me pretty much everything I know in TV. And this is a man who could come in the morning and he didn't even have to read the newspaper. He already knew what the headline would be. And I was like, how do you do that? And that was just unbelievably valuable and learning from him. And he was really wonderful. So we're still in touch. And that's a special thing that I was able to have in my career.
There was a senior writer when I worked at Time Magazine named Claudia Wallace, who covered like a lot of health and education and wellness issues. And she kind of took me under her wing while I was there. And I think not just kind of allowed me to see the possibility of things I might do, but I think also just gave me a lot of really important journalistic tools of, like, she was the kind of writer, there are writers who kind of decide the story they're going to write before they report it, which you shouldn't do, but people do it anyway. And she was one of those reporters who was the exact opposite. She always let the reporting inform what she was going to write, and I think she just passed on these ideas of nuance and fairness and wanting to be fair and wanting to be people to be fair with you that I think I carry with me at all times.
Last question. Who went to journalism school here?
Not me. And I never took an art class.
Or graduate school?
Not me.
Yeah, me neither.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions from all of you to our panel. And there are microphones at the front of the auditorium. There's one to the side, and I'll put one over here too if you want to just come up and ask any question.
Hi, Shel Horowitz from Hadley, trained as a journalist. You were talking very early in this panel about media literacy, and I just wanted to share an assignment that my second kid got in, I think, middle school, might have been high school, to follow the same story in the New York Times, Democracy Now!, and Fox News. I would love to see that a required class for every high school freshman.
Middle school, high school, and college.
I was just wondering how like a Smith student who's like getting this liberal arts degree, who like where our only like access to journalism on our resume is like 1 or 2 classes in the SoFi, and like how we can compete with journalism students to like break into the field.
I mean, I would say get an internship, but with the caveat that, as I told the students earlier, look, internships are not fair, right? I mean, a lot of them don't pay. The Gazette doesn't pay. We give college credit, or your school gives you college credit, and we can only use interns who get college credit. I mean, I wish it were different. I wish we could, I wish we had a program in place that could pay interns. Maybe that's something we should be looking into more seriously. But that's how I started. My college didn't offer anything in terms of journalism, so it was all work. It was all work that I did, and first as an intern and then just as a fact checker and just working my way up. So,
If you've worked on the Sophian, and if you want to be a journalist, then you're curious and you should be able to report. So even if you haven't gone to journalism school, you can figure out by reporting who are the people you need to reach out to, and reach out to them, and you can figure it out. It's no one's hiding under a rock, and then keep reaching out to them until they answer. And sometimes, man, I had some people who reached out every week for a year, and then one day I have an open job, and it's like, oh yeah, that person keeps reaching out, and so you never know. But that would be, if it's not the internship route, use your reporting skills.
I know that I've been through the same exact thing here because I wanted to get into journalism, and we didn't even have journalism classes when I was here. And so I think really think about using your time at the Sophian wisely, in the sense of, is there a beat you can focus on and report the hell out of that beat? Because I think what really helped me in getting the internship that I got just out of college at The Nation was that I had focused the bulk of my reporting here on the labor issues on campus. And so I had a portfolio of clips that showed I could not just report and write a story, but that I could follow it as it developed. I could break news. I could cover an aspect of college business that isn't always covered in a college newspaper. And I'm not saying you need to go out and report on labor, but I think try to choose an area of coverage and really just go to town on it, and then that way you have a good clip of portfolios by the time, a good portfolio of clips by the time you leave.
if you think journalism is important, you should tell that to the administration here. Create more journalism classes.
We'll do that too. Yeah. They're
Yeah.
going to get an earful from us.
When I say you, I mean students. You should take the journalism class that already exists. You know, students should, and you should ask for more of them.
I'd love to hear each of you talk about a story that you're particularly proud of your role in reporting or contributing to, but I'd love to hear something that you're kind of really proud of.
Well, probably the one that I'm the proudest of, I wasn't out in the streets reporting. I was in charge of the newsroom on September 11th. I was at ABC News Radio at that time, and I was number 2, and my boss, oddly enough, was on a plane leaving New York at that time. So we had to mobilize everybody very, 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 very quickly, and we wound up, we were live on the radio for 33 days in a row. And it was, I mean, it was crazy. It was all hands on deck, but I think we did a really good job, and I was incredibly proud of what everybody did, because it is a team sport, and everybody worked together selflessly, tirelessly, just, you know, killing themselves to report the hell out of the story. So that's probably the biggest one that I'm proud of.
I think what I'm doing right now in this time and space, and people always say, like, how did you get into the job you're in? And I'm like, I didn't know Trump was going to win the election. Like, I didn't know this was going to be the state of our country and civil society. But what I do on a daily basis, I think sometimes is so exhausting because it's exhausting. But I really think there's going to be a point where I'm going to look back and be like, okay, this is where we were supposed to be, this is what we were supposed to be doing, all the anger and you know, on both sides, and because it's tough every single day, it's pretty tough. It will be rewarding in the end when we look at it, I think, holistically, and we break down history on how, I think, media covered portions that especially I've been involved in, and I think it's odd because usually I wouldn't say here and now, but I actually think that's kind of where I stand. And every single day since the inaugural, I remember those first days at Dulles Airport when people were protesting and, you know, people weren't being allowed. I mean, that was like the first lightning charge of, oh my gosh, what is going on? And I think every day since then, I'm like, okay, we're part of history, and I think that's huge.
I think it's a story I did, and the name of the artist escapes me because I too am a little jet lagged and stayed up late working on a story last night. But there was an artist who, Trump had built those border wall prototypes on the border. I'm sure you saw photos of them in the news at some point for his wall that he wanted to build. And there was a European artist that came and wanted to, sort of as an act of art, wanted to have them declared works of land art. And this inspired, and he was kind of making fun of the border wall prototypes as, you know, just essentially these useless bits of political theater. But it was also this very sensitive time for the border of, like, Trump's starting to shut the border down. You know, he's deporting families, he's deporting parts of families, he's starting to seize children on the border, and this artist comes along and does this thing that just reads as very cavalier. And so I went down with this organized tour that the artist had organized, and did the tour and hung out with the artist, and then I spent time talking to people who lived on the Tijuana side of the border wall, including these 2 guys who lived in this, like, junkyard in a room adjacent to this junkyard that's like 10 feet from the border wall, and ended up reporting this whole story about the dynamics of creating something a monument, and what is a monument, and what, you know, what point is something ready to be declared a monument, and is it too soon? And one of the guys who lived in the junkyard was a guy who had been deported, and he was from LA, he'd grown up in LA his whole life. He happened to be born in Mexico, went to LA when he was like 8 months old, and he was like, I'm from LA, like, I'm not really from here, but I've been down here. And he raises his sleeve and he's like, see, and he shows me his LA Raiders tattoo. And for me, that story, and it was like an episode I wrote into the story, was, I think, a moment, like a lot of arts journalists who went and covered that story went and did the story on the artist and the border wall prototypes, and nobody really thought to spend time in the area around it. And I think when we think about the border and what the border is and who lives on the border and the types of people you find there, there's not a lot of nuance to that reporter. So I think that story is something I'm quite proud of.
I just wanted to ask one question, and then I think we have one more person. Well, I'll just ask my question, and that is that in the last election, it was very interesting to see all the fake news stories that were emerging, and I'm expecting there will be many more next year. And these are stories that are either things are taken out of context, or we have troll factories pushing out fake disinformation. So I'm curious about, in your organizations, we've heard a lot about myth busting and how your organizations are planning to address this. Because one of the articles that I read about this was saying, well, when you have one of these stories that's on Twitter, for example, and it's being shared all over, but then when the newspaper goes and reports it, then many, many more people will read it, and it reinforces an incorrect message. So I'm just curious about how you are addressing these things, or how you expect you will in the next year. Sorry.
When things are incorrectly reported?
Well, when you know there are these stories out there that are completely false, but what do you do?
We don't really report on that so much at the Gazette. I mean, we're really focused on the local news. Oh, sorry. At the Gazette, we're really focused on the local news, so I don't feel we have such as big of a role in spreading, and adding to this echo chamber. We have other kinds of echo chambers, but maybe you want to speak to that more about spreading. I understand your question, kind of, I think.
Well, it's also, too, how do you address misinformation, or how do you try to counteract it? Because sometimes
it's funny. It's here's the thing. Like fake news, I get asked about it all the time, and it can be called disinformation or misinformation or fake news. But to be honest, fake news isn't something I really think about unless I'm in a panel. I'm serious, because at the Gazette, what we think about is reporting the news. So it comes up in intellectual discourse and conversations, but in our day-to-day, we're just reporting the news, and we're getting it factually correct. And if we get it wrong, which doesn't happen all that often, we run a correction. So, I mean, that's...
I think maybe what you're going after is the disinformation that gets promulgated across social media. And that's a different animal from what we all do, or what I used to do, and what these nice ladies do. And I know that NBC, I know that the Washington Post and VOA, and when it comes up, I'm sure you at the Gazette do the same thing, and I'm sure the LA Times does the same thing, where we are fact-checking as many things as we possibly can fact-check in the business. But what we can't fact-check in journalism organizations is what's going out on Facebook. Because Facebook is this weird amalgam of, not journalism, but also journalism in like through the looking glass. And until Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and whoever else comes up take on the responsibility that they should, I think, have for journalism, these disinformation pieces are going to continue in social media. And journalism organizations are going to continue to fact check. I mean, you can't get away from the fact checking. It's everywhere, on every network, on every, serious newspaper. So I think really you're kind of talking about two different things, and I don't know that journalism organizations can actively go after, every individual disinformation. When it becomes a huge story like Pizzagate and things like that, then of course it becomes a news story, and then there's reporting on the news story.
I also think in response to that issue, which is really important, like these things that end up being narratives even though that they're not real news, and sometimes end up being reported as news, is that I feel like certainly since Trump got elected and shortly before that, there's been far more critical coverage of the tech companies As a result, I think if there's one weapon journalism has in all of this, it's like you can't go and provide counterfactuals for every crazy conspiracy theory that gets spread on Facebook. But what you can do is have a look at these companies and how they operate and what their interests are. And I mean, there was that leaked Zuckerberg audio the other day where he said he was going to go after Elizabeth Warren if she tried to break up Facebook. But there's just been a lot of really good reporting in the last couple of years about like, you know, that you could sell advertising, you could buy advertising on Facebook geared at white supremacists. And so as a result of news reporting that was done related to that, Facebook disabled that function. They started to look more critically at how they sell advertising on the website. And so I think some of that is going to not be countered by us trying to counter every lie, but at looking at the companies that purvey it and make money off of it.
Hi. Thanks for coming tonight. I just have a nagging question, and I'm hoping that you guys can offer some perspective about it. Why does the media regurgitate all the tweets and exclamations all day long? It's similar, without, it seems, any discipline. Or, I mean, it's, at the least, it's redundant and boring. At the worst, it's harmful. Because as you know, when something is repeated often, it gets remembered. And then the more it's remembered, the more people may think it's true. So yes, it touches on that, but I'd really like to hear, in your experience and in your world, why that happens. I mean, there must be some way to counter that. And I don't want to believe that the news feels they have to, because they have to entertain people, or they have to, you know, because it's the same hour after hour after hour, and it's not a good service, you know. And if you do have an idea how that might change, or what the electorate could do, what citizens could do, what would be helpful to make that shift and encourage the media to operate a little differently around that, given the reality of what's happening with tweets and stuff.
I'm going to let the hard news types take it.
I will just say, and then I will pass the mic to the SVP of News, I mean, we are covering the White House. We are covering the President of the United States. This is how the President communicates, like it or not. He communicates by Marine One, and he communicates to us via Twitter. That is different from how other presidents chose to communicate and their administrations chose to communicate. So to your point, I think maybe everyone's trying to learn kind of what that balance is and how to handle also the things that are said are provocative. They are, they can have expletives in them. These are things that we haven't seen from a historical standpoint. And so I think there are times where we need to take the moment to have the discussion about what's happening. And they are so frequent that, I mean, there can be up to, 15, 16 in a day. So I don't want to say that we're just focusing on the same one, but I mean, this is how this White House chooses to communicate to the American people. And I think, I understand there's a frustration level of seeing that graphic and seeing the tweets, but I think our job also is to responsibly cover what is coming out of that administration and out of the White House. And I do feel like there are times where I think everyone has that sense of exhaustion, even like, it's hard for me to follow the president on Twitter because I don't like seeing what's on the screen over and over and over. But I think we have a responsibility to really take that head on. And so to not cover that, I don't know how we would do that, because he's communicating to us in a very different way that we've never seen before, and so we're trying to do the best we can to be able to have that coverage point. And I understand that there is a little bit of a balance that goes with that, but we have covered past administrations and presidential press conferences. They just haven't communicated to the American people in the way that this president is communicating to us.
I accept everything you said, but I have a slightly different take on it. I agree with you, madam, wherever you are. There you are. It is exhausting. It is repetitive. It is often new tweets, but it is often not new tweets. And it is show after show after show talking about the same thing that was the most important thing at 9, it's the most important thing at 10, it's the most important thing at 11, according to the people who are producing the news. And I do think it can become, it becomes negative for the viewer rather than illuminating for the viewer. As I said before, I care about what happens around the whole world. I obviously care about what happens in this country, but I also think that what's going on around the world is important for a news audience to pay attention to. I would prefer not to have the repetitiveness all the way through the day, but to have more nuanced coverage of what's going on through the US and around the world. And I think that can happen. Now here's the why of it. Well, there are two whys. One is it is a lot less expensive for a news organization to have people on talking to each other than it is to create a narrative with a beautiful package, telling a story. That costs money. That's the teams that go out, the camera people, the sound people, the reporters, the producers. So what you're seeing on TV, on all the cable programs where it's just talk all day, is because that's the least expensive way to manage that operation and still grab viewers. So that's number one. Number two is, Sarah's right, we've never had a political situation that we have right now before. And so it is complicated or challenging to make the choice to look away or change the focus for your viewer to something that isn't what everyone's talking about. And so the combination of those two things, I think, has had a detrimental effect on news coverage, at least on the cable news companies in this country, because they don't allow for a more nuanced, broader sense of identifying what news is.
I wanted to address a different part of the question, which is you're asking, why do you, the media, do this? And I guess when I hear that, the media is another word that I don't really use. It's funny, the things that come up in conversation, like in a panel, that we don't really talk about. Like, we don't use those. Yes, we're the news media. We have an editor at work who always says, it's not the media, it's the news media. He wants to make that distinction. But we're also different, even right here. I mean, I work at a small local newspaper. You have this long career where you've been a producer and now are doing work for VOA and spending time in Africa and like doing all these things. You are a booking director at MSNBC, cable, network. And you are a staff writer at the Los Angeles Times, which in a way is its own local paper, but it's also a national paper. And so, yes, we're all the media, but we have such different experiences that I don't actually lump us all together in that same way. And so that's why I guess I had trouble answering Mary's question and your question, is because at the Gazette, we don't really run the kinds of stories that you're talking about. Yeah, we do once in a while run an Associated Press story about some stupid thing that the president said. I think I can say that. I'm not supposed to say stuff like that, I guess, but we do. I mean, we do run those stories, but we don't. We're not like we're not a TV station. We're not running it all day long. We're not. It's just we're not part of that. So that's why I'm personally having trouble answering that question. But also, like, I remember when he said the thing about the shithole countries and the grab them by the this and all that stuff. And I've worked for the New York Times. I've worked with this, what would be the equivalent of a standards team there in some ways, which is the style desk, the copy desk. You know, and they have such strict rules about what you can and can't say. And I wrote for a story once, someone in a quote said the word fart, and I put that in a quote. And the editor, the copy editor, everybody came down, no, 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 that can't be, that can't be. And then all of a sudden, you know, Trump started saying these things, and words you can't imagine are ending up on the front page. And it's very important that they're on the front page, and it's very important that they're spelled out and not just hyphenated, that we're not all so prudish and squeamish about it, because if that's what he said, then we need to feel the full impact of that. So I think it is important to quote him, to repeat it. We need to know it. Not for entertainment value, but we need to know it.
Please join me in thanking our panel, and thank you all. Thank you so much for your attention and your questions.